I hope you enjoyed your lunch, and I'm hoping some of you had a few drinks so that you're fired up and ready to argue here, because this is a very important panel on free speech, or what's left of it. I'm your, I'm not a good person to have around, actually. I'm your moderator, Alvino Mario Fantini, although they cut my name. V told there's a complaint to be lodged against New Direction there. Well, for many years I was a financial journalist in London and other places in South America, and then I wound up in the multilateral world. I don't recommend it, although the salaries are tax-free, so there's that. But now, happily, I publish and edit this magazine, The European Conservative. It's a quarterly, and there's a website, too, that's more news and analysis that Ellen, who is my wife, manages out of Brussels. I recommend both the journal and the website highly, and not because we're involved, but because one of the objectives of this project, the European Conservative, is to break open that little space into which we've all been pushed as conservatives, you know, being told you can't read these books, you can't interview these people, you can't hang out with Thierry Baudet. Well, we do it. We have no cordon sanitaire, and we think fundamentally that exposure to ideas, no matter how noxious or challenging, is necessary for all of us. So when people ask, well, how is free speech doing? Do you have free speech? You must, Mario. You must benefit from free speech, especially since your office in Brussels is 2 minutes from the European Parliament and the European Commission, against which we invade daily. And yet no one's come to the door yet. There's no policeman coming to shut us down. So yes, we benefit from freedom of speech, but only up to a point, Lord Copper, if any of you have ever read Scoop by Evelyn Waugh. There's this famous line basically saying, well, yes, but not really. There is free speech, but it's increasingly curtailed and circumscribed by a variety of mechanisms and actors. And I'm hoping in the next 90 minutes or so we'll get into this. We'll hear from our two speakers who I'm about to introduce, and then a discussion with you all in the audience. And if you remain silent, then I'll just instigate things by throwing questions at the speakers. As I was preparing my chaotic little notes for this introduction, I came across a meme that I don't have to put up on the screen, so it's not the best. I'll just describe it, but it had me laughing for a long time, and then it also had me reflecting on free speech. And I'll describe it in a moment, because when I do talk about free speech and its importance and why it's important to have open dialogue for a truly engaged citizenry, people say, oh, well, you're saying that because you were born and raised in the United States. Now, of course you're going to say that, because you Americans fetishize free speech. And the meme that got me thinking about this it's a painting of all the founding fathers, you know, sitting around the table. I think they're drafting the Declaration, or the Constitution rather, and one chap is saying to the other, wait, so we're going to let people say whatever they want in America? And the other chap with a wig and 18th century garb says, yeah, we're going to let them say whatever they want. And another guy says, yeah, and let's give them guns. And then Benjamin Franklin's off to the side saying, laugh my ass off, this country's going to be lit. And there was a time when the United States was lit. And there were brawls and fights in pubs. I'm not advocating that. And people spoke openly and honestly about so many things, and there was vigorous debate and deliberation. And it created, for a time, a really great country. A country now in decline, like much of the West. Here in Europe, having been here now 25 years, and having lived in the Netherlands and Denmark and Italy, the UK, and now Austria, I've been seeing more and more examples of violations of free speech. Some forms or mechanisms used are very subtle, kind of quiet, and others not so subtle. And they occur across industries and sectors and societies and nations. And it's my impression that the one place in the world, the Anglosphere, that most cherished and prized and defended freedom of speech for so many decades, possibly centuries, it is there that free speech is in fastest retreat. the UK. So many examples to give there. Actually, free speech is not in retreat. Let me rephrase that. I put down here, it's being clobbered and pummeled and wrestled to the ground by forces and powers, both internal and external. And I'll get to that in my own comments after these two gentlemen speak. For right now, I must remain docile and in command of my time and my place here as moderator. So let me proceed to introduce our two speakers, actually three if you count me. First, Alastair, who I just had the pleasure of meeting, Alastair Donald. He's the Associate Director of the Academy of Ideas and co-convener of the Battle of Ideas. I like that name. He's also Secretary of Ideas Matter and convener of Living Freedom, an initiative that exists to renew freedom through education and vigorous debate. Sounds like you're exactly on the right panel. He's also an author and co-editor of two books, one on the history of the city and another on the idea and future of the concept of community. I'm very interested in talking to you about that later. And I'm particularly intrigued by the fact that Alastair is a founding member of something called Mantown Human? Yeah. Mantown Human, which published a manifesto towards a new humanism in architecture. Very interesting. Welcome. Thank you for coming. And I'll introduce Rob and then give you, Alastair, the floor. Okay? And Rob, who you've met yesterday, currently the Vice President of New Direction, spent many years as an MEP for, well, in later years for the Juist Antwoord, Just Answer? Did I pronounce it?
Yes.
Close.
Juiste antwoord.
Happily, I'd like to note that he's also very internationally minded. He believes in the creation of these international networks and alliances on the right, having participated in Vox's Madrid Forum, very interesting initiative that we should all be watching and supporting if possible. Rob was Vice Chair of the ECR Group and now, like I said, Vice President of New Direction. Now, final comment, I don't know much about your previous telecoms experience, but I'm hoping you might find a way to weave that into here. I'm sure you have some insights to bring from that industry to freedom of speech. If not, no worries. Anyway, with that, I'll be quiet and sit down. Alastair, you have the lectern.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. And hello, everyone. We had a bit of an exchange, Alvino and Mario and myself and Rob, actually, before the conference started, and he was saying to me, my fear is that on free speech things are getting much, much, much worse, and I hope you guys are going to be able to cheer us up a little bit. I'm not sure that I'm going to be the man that's going to be able to do that, to be honest. In fact, I've put Rob on suicide watch just in case there's it tips you over. A session called Free Speech Debate in Europe is not exactly a niche topic. It's not like I'm scratching my head thinking there's not very much to say here. It's more a question of knowing where to start and how many days it is that we've got to actually discuss this topic. So no shortage of things to say. As was mentioned, I'm the co-convener of Battle of Ideas Festival, a large public festival in London. And over the last couple of months, I've been working quite hard to put in place a series of free speech discussions to take place at that festival. And when I tell you the topics that we're going to discuss, things like cultural boycotts and artistic freedom, the way that equity, diversity and inclusion creates compelled speech, the challenges of academic freedom, the misinformation wars, anti-Semitism on campus, where do you draw the boundaries in terms of free speech, the effect of equality laws on freedom, whether we could benefit in Europe, countries in Europe, from a US-style First Amendment. These are the sort of things that we're going to discuss over a single weekend of a public festival. As you can see, there's no shortage of topics to discuss on free speech. John Sullivan, in his opening comments yesterday afternoon, I thought was quite interesting when he talked about a historic shift in the political landscape, which whether he meant it or not, but I took it to mean that a couple of centuries since the French Revolution of kind of broadly speaking a framework of left and right politics had come to an end with a new era of kind of elite versus populism. And I think it's fair to say, and I'm going to argue this to some extent, that when it comes to freedom and free speech, I think we're seeing a similarly seismic shift. It's a historic shift in the way that we understand these issues and the way that we think about them. So with such a large terrain, I thought really I'd try and just do three things. First of all, to look at some of the recent developments in freedom and free speech in the 20th century, and look at how there's been kind of a breakdown in a lot of the existing categories of the way that we understand these things. Secondly, to look at a few consequences that presents us for today. And then thirdly, to very briefly at the end, just think about how we address some of the challenges. So the past century, the standard models, the standard ways that I think have thought about and pursued free speech have been things like through civil liberties, through civil rights, and often through human rights as well. And all of them, to me, recently seem to become either outdated, redundant, or even, to some extent, part of the problem when we're thinking about free speech. So if you take something like civil liberties, first of all, which emerges in its modern form, I think it's fair to say, in the kind of interwar periods of the 20th century. That's when organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union and in the UK, Liberty, or what was then the National Council for Civil Liberties, that was when they were born. And they were predicated on a period of political struggle. Increasingly, that struggle was on the streets and in the public square. And there was a need to kind of create a space where you could debate politics freely, to keep the state out of our affairs, to protect a space for freedom and the pursuit of free speech within civil society. Often, I think worth noting, pursued through the nation state, which created a focus for political parties to push back and create that space for freedom and to introduce laws, and then they could be defended in the contest around free speech. And it seems to me that in so many ways over the past 2 or 3 decades, those things have disappeared. I mean, politics to some extent has collapsed as a future-orientated force. The nation state has been very much taken over by the kind of supranational organizations. And it seems that the civil liberties model has really started to fall apart, to the extent, I would argue, that if you go to these days to a meeting organized by civil liberties organization, they spend quite a lot of their time talking about human rights rather than civil liberties themselves. So I think that model has largely gone in recent years. Secondly, civil rights. And whereas civil liberties tried to keep the state out of civic society, obviously the civil rights movements wanted a guarantee of protection for the equal rights that were promised under the kind of modern market system. The classic period, of course, I would say is the 60s and the 70s, when you think about ethnic minorities and women and gay men and women, took up the fight, very much aided by expanding the boundaries of free speech in order to claim those equal rights. It's a very important part of the struggle for equality. But in winning those equal rights, and I would argue that those struggles, those battles were largely actually won in the 60s and the 70s. But somehow in winning those, we seem to go from a situation where those fighting for those equal rights were seen as active agents, creating in the fight for their own future, to people who were looked upon as largely as victims of the way that society operated. They were often, in the period afterwards, started to be portrayed as vulnerable groups in need of state protection, which included, ironically, limiting free speech and limiting criticism of minority groups. I mean, that's very much the ethos of contemporary equality law. So effectively what started out as a fight to expand free speech to achieve equal rights, I would argue has ended up in a situation where in order to protect minorities, then free speech is diminished and curtailed. And I think you see that in so many of the situations where equality is talked about today, that free speech has effectively become a privilege if you express the right views, rather than something that you enjoy as a condition of life. And you've very much seen that, for example, around the gender critical feminists situation over the past couple of years. Thirdly, just to mention human rights, the inalienable rights, very much a sort of post-war, 20th century post-war movement. It's worth just reading, actually, the famous Article 19 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Rights. It says, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers." You just think about that. That last bit especially, receive and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. And then you think about the current discussion on fake news and misinformation and how we use things like social media. And you think, well, human rights is not exactly protecting free speech in that sort of situation. And I think very much if you go through a whole panoply of situations today, whether it's hate speech or COVID lockdowns and the kind of anti-COVID lockdown discussion that was very much shut down, academic freedom, equity and inclusion initiatives that create this very much compelled speech situation, things like proposed restrictions on Islamophobia, the restrictions through equality law and gender-critical expression of skepticism towards trans ideology. And you think, well, human rights has not come to the rescue of people who want to speak in any of those spheres. So those models of the 20th century, the way that free speech was pursued, I think are very much in trouble. But it's not just that those categories are broken down, but I think what they represent is actually a far deeper and far more troubling situation, which is basically that the demise of those models, I think, leads you to understand just how much so many of the building blocks of free speech, of the kind of intellectual support system that you, if you like, for free speech that have developed over the past 2, 3, 4 centuries have actually started to be jettisoned in the recent times. So you think of something like toleration, the famous 17th century movement where, or ideal, where we wanted to protect people's right to believe differently, especially in the religious context, but then also in the political context and more recently the cultural context. And just think now the idea of tolerance, which has become about protecting minorities from criticism. It basically says you must respect people rather than you must tolerate opinions that you don't like. Or you think about something like Immanuel Kant's idea of having the courage to see to use your own understanding, to think for yourself, basically, using reasoned judgment as to what it is that's good for you or the people that you mix with. And then you think about today's society, and we have experts everywhere willing, all too willing to offer you advice on every single aspect of your life because you're not trusted to use your and exercise your judgment. Or you think of J.S. Mill's affirmation of individual agency and only to be limited where there was a possibility that you'd actually harm others. And then you think about today's world where the entire conception of society is one of a series of vulnerable groups who are all at risk of harm, and everybody rushes around protecting them, and therefore free speech goes out the window. So the harm principle, which was part of the expansion of the boundaries of free speech, has been turned around completely so that everybody is now at risk of harm, and it's used as the mechanism to limit free speech. I've not got my clock down there, so I don't know. 10, okay. So that's kind of the history and recent events. Let me turn to today and some of the consequences of what that means. And I'm just going to go through 3 or 4 things that I think are worth thinking about a little bit. The first is that effectively what we've now done is gone back to a situation which we're familiar with from history, where we've basically traded freedom for the promise of security. For centuries, the impetus was at every point to expand the prospects for free speech and to push back the boundaries so that we had more free speech. But if you listen to any discussion on pretty much any topic today, then when people talk about where to draw the boundaries of free speech, it's always with a kind of prior view that they want to constrain it and to pull in the limits and to make it less free speech. Basically, and I forget who uses this expression, I think it might be Greg Lukianoff from the American head of the FIRE organization, but freedom of speech is effectively turned into freedom from speech. It's been flipped around. We no longer have freedom of speech, but people want to protect us from speech. Speech has become effectively a risky business. We need safe spaces in universities. We need online harms legislation to protect us from online harms. Even actually the logic of the university safe space permeates so much of public society these days. So if you look at something like the furore that went on a few years ago in the newsroom of the New York Times, where all the journalists were all of a sudden desperate for people not to print things. It was like the kind of safe space of a university, but transposed to the editorial rooms of a major newspaper. You know, editorial rooms are famously robust types of places at the best of times. And the state is always there to protect us. So freedom effectively takes second place to safety as a principle. The second thing I want to mention is that, second consequence, is that quite often these days we're seeing what I would call the upstreaming of censorship. So I've talked about the state being ready there to protect us, to protect everyone from speech. But is the state the all-powerful thing that it's often talked about to be? I mean, in many ways, you think the state, in some ways, reflects the wider societal anxieties. So, for example, I constantly have the sense that governments and states are quite nervous because of their disconnection from the people. If you take, for example, the recent election in the UK, where we've new Labour government with a huge majority in Parliament, historic almost majority in Parliament in terms of the number of seats, but only 20% of the entire British electorate actually voted for the new Labour government. So they're very much a government that's got quite a perilous connection with wider society, despite the fact they've got lots of seats in Parliament. And it results in many ways, a kind of hyperactively interventionist type of state that's always keen to put the lid on any potential problems and to put the lid on it in a way that's intervening at quite an early stage in order to stop things happening. I mean, in the past, you might think the way that controls on speech were exercised were because, well, for example, because society had quite a very strong sense of moral values, or it had a very strong sense of a rule of law that codified what society thought. These days, though, the way that censorship works quite often is it moves upstream before speech even gets to become a matter of public discussion. I think you can very much see this in the way that digital censorship is starting to offer. So if anybody heard or read about the Twitter files, for example, in America, which was a collusion between the security state in America and big tech, which basically was to take down and remove people from Twitter before they even got to express what they wanted to express. Or you have a situation in Europe just now where the EU's Digital Services Act basically formalizes a hidden war on free speech. It's Terry Breton, who's the kind of EU digital censor-in-chief, if you like, was obviously sacked yesterday, as I'm sure many of you would have seen. But he was basically exposed as trying to do a deal with Elon Musk, offering immunity from prosecution on the grounds that the X or Twitter or whatever you want to call it secretly censored speech in a deal, the kind of behind closed doors deal. So that speech is not even getting into the public sphere because people are operating to censor it. Or you take something like the National Conservative conference that took place in Brussels earlier this year, which there was an attempt to shut down, and which 2 judges wanted to shut down and would have shut down, and it was only actually the bravery of well, on the one hand, a venue operator who stood up and resisted the dynamic towards shutting it down, and also a judge who, for whatever reason, I don't know, but somehow this time the 3rd judge decided that it was okay to go ahead. But what you can see is that public discussion is becoming ruled over by the judiciary and becoming shut down before we even see it. I think safe spaces very much operate in that logic, by the way, in universities and elsewhere, is that certain ideas are not welcome and you cannot have the discussion. So we've seen a kind of upstreaming of censorship over recent years. And that leads me to the 3rd thing I want to talk about, which is the politicization of the law against free speech. And in the UK, we've just elected Keir Starmer, head of the new Prime Minister, who is the former Director of Public Prosecutions in Britain. In America, there's a pretty good chance, due to the ineptitude of the opposition, that Kamala Harris, the former Attorney General in California, will also be elected as the American president, which will leave us with 2 of the foremost political figures in the Western world, both who are prosecutors by nature, rather than what you would call traditional politicians. So right at the top of government, we have these prosecutorial figures. Keir Starmer once said, "Human rights brought policies into the law for me." So he very much sees a kind of conflation of rights and political power and the law. And I think it's increasingly evident the way that the politicization of legal enforcement and the law is being used in quite an interesting and very unique and dubious way against free speech. We often have these situations of the pursuit of lawfare, for example, where the actions that people want to take, which are politically completely acceptable, but they find ways of politicizing the law to stop them happening. And it leads to, and this is the final point on this before I just conclude, is that we're living in a situation where something like cancel culture has already created a very arbitrary public environment. If you think about, if anybody read the John Ronson book about being shamed, he's full of very good examples of the way that cancel culture operates. So one example he gives is someone does a fairly innocuous tweet as just before they are about to get on a flight from America to Africa. They they land 13 hours or whatever later in Africa, and by then the tweet has gone round the world. There's been uproar about what they tweeted, which was a daft joke, stupid joke, and they've been cancelled. And you can just see the way that the world operates in a very, very arbitrary way, because the kind of stability, the ability that ideals like toleration bring you in terms of dealing with the uncertainty of society and having a bit of sort of sense of security and predictability about the way society operates. Without toleration, that security and ability to predict the way things operate very much diminishes, and you start to live in a very arbitrary world, which leaves us with a society that, you know, arbitrary societies are at the root of totalitarianism, if that's not too big a claim to make. So these are dangerous developments. Right, let me finish very quickly with just a few brief thoughts on how we address some of these challenges. It seems to me that one of the primary things we need is a search for intellectual clarity as to the nature of some of these problems. These are new things, there are very new things that are happening in society over recent years. I think thus far we're still lacking the depth of understanding that we need about them. And we need, in order to develop that understanding, I would argue, to be discussing and debating these issues much, much more with all people of all opinions, and particularly, as it happens, those that we disagree with, because it's only through the conflictual type of arguments that you can have with those that you disagree with that you can actually gain a sense of clarity as to what the real problem is. So I think political labels these days are much less use than trying to evolve a new set of political principles. I think something that, for those of you that were there yesterday, James Orr hinted at in his talk when he was talking about the importance of the nation and whether conservatives who believe in the nation should actually have a much more robust set of arguments with those conservatives that are kind of on board with the supranational stuff. I think those arguments are there to be had and should be had, and it doesn't really matter whether the political label you have. If you can argue around a set of principles, then you'll arrive at a much better understanding of the way the world works. Secondly, I think we need to support much more the struggle for individual choice and for choice making more broadly. We need to keep the state and its army of experts away from assuming responsibility for the decisions and the choices that we wish to make. It doesn't really matter whether that's what we might choose to eat or drink, the kind of fundamental things that everybody wants to seem to get involved in, whether it's about asserting our right to decide for ourselves, whether we put pronouns in our email signature, or whether it's who it is that we wish to listen to or to read in terms of writers or tweeters or whatever. Those are choices that I think we need to be much more assertive of our own ability to make rather than someone else to decide for us. And I think that is the only way that we can start to reassert autonomy. Finally, I think we need to build a culture of free speech. And I emphasize the culture in this aspect, because I think, as has been suggested before, we live in an era where kind of hyperactive lawmaking. I think we need less law and more of a dynamic towards cultural and political support for freedom. Keep politics away from the law, keep them separate, nor can I just don't think that free speech can really be legislated into existence. I think it requires the hard work of winning intellectual arguments, political arguments, cultural arguments, and building a new intellectual support system for freedom. That is why I'm involved in organising Battle of Ideas. That's what the festival does. And I think if we could make steps towards all of us being much more involved in public discussion and public debates with people that we disagree with especially, then that stands to make for a much more important and fertile public culture that could then start to regain the trust of the public especially as free speech that's something worth fighting for. Thank you.
So, I like to keep things simple. Free speech is not about the speech you like. Nice stuff doesn't need protection. It's the stuff that you hate that needs protection. So that someone like the government or the left-wing liberals cannot decide what others should hear. And for those who don't like it, it's their right to disagree and speak out their own mind. It's just that simple. But free speech is under attack. In Brazil, Elon Musk platform X has been shut down because Musk refused to ban subscribers and also members of the parliament, of the opposition, because they criticized the Lula's government and also the Supreme Court, Alastair de Moraes. In Scotland, there is this hate crime law. Transgender identity discussion can make you go to jail. In Belgium, former right-wing politician Dries van Langenhoven has been sentenced for 1 year in prison and fined 24,000 euros for being part of a messaging group that contained hate speech, despite no having written any of the messages himself. In the UK, we have two-tier Keir Starmer. He has locked up people up for years for speaking out against the mass migration, while grooming gangs have been able to abuse hundreds of very young children for years without political or police interference. In the EU, we have the Digital Services Act that is activated to moderate online conversations. But moderation is just another word for censorship. And Ursula von der Leyen is now calling it debunking. But the only thing they want is to control the narrative. And also here in Ireland, we have the hate speech bill, and that seeks to criminalize the possession of material likely to incite hatred. And this includes memes or photos saved on devices with up to 5 years of jail time. And yet it's not clear what the definition of hate is. It's just a few examples, but there is much more. It's also happening in the United States, it's happening in New Zealand, it's happening in the rest of South America. In all of our Western society, the freedom of speech is under attack, and it's spreading like a virus. And it's no coincidence, it seems to be coordinated. We saw the same thing happening during COVID with all the restrictions imposed on us, like the lockdowns, the mask mandates, vaccination coercion, the same measures everywhere in the West at the same time. And why is free speech under attack? I think it has two reasons. And the first one is just Soviet Union-style censorship. The establishment lost control over the accepted narrative because of the internet and social media. Left liberal governments, supported by left liberal media, of course, are now abusing the legal system to silence political opponents, all in the name of fighting disinformation and misinformation. The fight against disinformation used to be a fight against foreign interference, especially during elections, but nowadays it's a fight of our own governments against its own citizens with unwanted opinions. And this started after the election of Trump and after the election of Brexit. Then they felt they lost control. And this is also what the Digital Services Act was designed for, controlling the narrative. And this is exactly what happened during COVID. The second reason why free speech is in danger is political correctness. And let's have a better look at that. Political correctness, driven by our primal instinct, can threaten the very foundation of free speech, leading us down a slippery slope towards conformity and tyranny. If you live in a democracy where you're not allowed to express controversial views for fear of offending those in power, you're not really living in a free society. Let's begin with the concept of correctness in general. From our earliest days as a species, our survival depended on our ability to belong to a group. Acceptance by others meant protection, access to resources, but also the chance to pass your genes. This need for social belonging has ingrained in us as an instinct to comply, to say yes even when we deep down want to say no. This instinct to avoid rejection, while vital in ancient times, has evolved into a powerful social force that shapes our behavior today. In the political arena, this instinct manifests as political correctness. Politicians and voters alike often adopt popular stances or make concessions, not necessarily because they believe in them, but because they fear alienating supporters or being ostracized. But this instinct can be and often is abused. Politicians manipulate our desire for acceptance by promoting emotionally charged messages that appeal to our fears and to our desires. They pressure individuals and groups to conform, leveraging the fear of rejection to silence dissent. And this abuse leads to the erosion of democratic values as critical thinking, and genuine debate is replaced by conformity and groupthink. A particularly troubling aspect of this trend is the use of labeling and stigmatizing to sideline political opponents. In today's polarized environment, we see these tactics in debates over immigration, climate policy, and also in public health. Rather than engaging with opposing arguments like labels like racist, climate denier, or anti-vaxxer are successfully used to discredit and exclude voices from the conversation. This approach not only undermines free speech, but also stifles the open exchange of ideas that is essential to a healthy democracy. This tactics has become more pronounced with the rise of identity politics, the wokeism, and the influence of social media. Complex issues are reduced to sound bites, and opponents are quickly stigmatized, often without any fair hearing. And this trend has intensified with the internet's rapid dissemination of information. As a result, in debates, the incentive to discredit rather than engage in substantive discussion has grown. Now, how does this relate to free speech? When we allow labels to silence dissenting opinions, we erode the very foundation of free speech. The fear of being stigmatized discourages people from expressing unpopular or controversial views, leading to self-censorship. And this is antithetical to the democratic ideal of a free and open exchange of ideas, where all perspectives can be heard and critically examined. And self-censorship is the most dangerous form of censorship. Without free speech, democracy will die. But the left liberals say there is a balance to be struck, protecting free speech while also considering the rights of others is a delicate task, and the others that are the minorities that Alastair just mentioned, genders, etc. So now it's all about emotions, about people feeling offended. I don't care if people feel offended. Nothing happens if someone feels offended. If it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. Emotional harm, while probably is real, is subjective and impossible to define within a legal framework. A legal system that prioritizes emotional responses over objective standards risk becoming inconsistent, leading to suppression of legitimate free speech and ultimately to tyranny. The challenge for us as conservatives is to use the laws in a way that protect both free speech and individuals' rights without allowing subjective emotions to dictate the boundaries of acceptable discourse. We must avoid the slippery slope where initial restrictions on speech justified by the desire to prevent offense gradually expand to silence dissenting opinions. We must guard against the abuse of political correctness that stifles debate and leads to conformity. At the same time, we must ensure that laws protect the fundamental freedoms that are the cornerstone of our democracy. Only through ongoing dialogue, judicial oversight, and a commitment to these principles, we can avoid the slide into authoritarianism and preserve the free and open society that we cherish. We should never be worried about the shouting of the bad people, but we should be worried about the silence of the good people. Democracy and freedom will die if good people remain silent. I keep it up to here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. That was excellent.
I was going to make my own comments, but let me just interrupt that or put that aside for now. Does anyone want to ask any questions of our two speakers? They've said a lot of very interesting things. Chap in the back.
Very interesting. I think
You'll get a mic. Sorry. Thanks.
Is that working? Great. Thank you very much. Really interesting. One of my questions really is about, do you think those on the right have failed to properly engage the idea that humans are fundamentally emotional rather than rational creatures? And perhaps this is why the left have managed to pursue this idea of denigration over substantiation. And is there anything we could do? And Mario, I'm interested in your thoughts as the editor of a publication. Do you think the right has to be more emotional when it makes its arguments in order to combat what is an overly emotional left?
I'll answer, but you first. Either of you?
Well, of course, it's all about emotions with people. That's also about the stock market and all the things. But still, if we take that into account, we cannot have a real debate about things. People can be offended, and that's what I said. I don't care if people are offended. You know, it's always the hypocrisy from the left, because they try to avoid that people are offended, and in the same time they call us all kinds of names. They don't have any problem with that. So, but we as, let's say, conservatives, we always try to convince people with arguments, and let's be honest, I think we have the best arguments, and that's why they use this tool that is in our reptile brain to keep us, to keep our forces down. So should we be emotional? I think we are emotional, but still we try to come up with rational arguments and to have a real debate instead of silencing people. I think it's not good. I'm on X, and people say a lot of ugly things about me, but they have the right to do so. I never block anyone unless they try to, well, if they call for violence or something, but that doesn't happen. So, but if they call me quite bad names, but it's their right to do that, and I think we should accept that.
Alastair.
Well, I agree with that last point, that people who are emotional shouldn't be shut down, and they can say what they like in any sort of emotional way. I'm not on board with the idea, though, that a kind of emotionalism is the way to win political arguments or to defend free speech. In fact, if you look at the experience of the last 20 or 30 years, it's been the slow move of society towards organizing itself around feelings and around emotions and around emoting, which has become part of the necessary rigmarole that you've got to go through within public life in order to get a hearing. That to me has been completely a destructive move, not least of all because that's the terrain on which free speech is so limited these days, because you have people say that we are quite fragile beings, we do get emotionally upset, that's just the human character. And if you accept that, then they have some, they manage to win the day in terms of the arguments to limit free speech. So I'm not against people emoting and being emotional about things, but use some reasoned arguments, and I think you've got a much better chance of making a good political or cultural case for what it is that you want society to be like in the future.
I agree. I'll answer this too. I agree with both of them up to a point. Again, Lord Copper, because the European Conservative was born, in the bosom of an organization formed by people like Roger Scruton and Remy Bragg, Andras Lanci of Hungary, and others. And its purpose was always to offer reasoned arguments in defense of conservatism or right-wing ideas, etc. And yet, what we've seen is that we're losing younger readers who are gravitating toward the more passionate stuff. So I prefer using the word passion. I think we need to start using mechanisms, tools, content that is geared to stir people's passions, because the passions are out there. They're flowing out. You look at the Trump phenomenon. Look at the anger on the streets of several European cities. So how do we channel that passion? That's the question. But I don't like this word emote or emotion. I agree with you, Alastair. Is that a good response from the three? Okay. Miguel.
Thank you. My question is specifically for Alastair. Because I am a politician and we have to persuade people, it's doubly difficult for a conservative, because not only do we have to defend our arguments, but we also have to dispel the myths that are built about us and fight the lies and the attacks that are already ingrained in the system. And one of the things that I try to use as an example to awake people who tend to be, conservatives tend to be older generation, is to make them understand that the mainstream media are unreliable. And the way that one of the ways that I try to convey this is by reminding them that there used to be a debate on what would happen to journalism with the emergence of the internet as a source of news. And we used to have that debate. What will happen to the journalists, what will happen to media if the internet becomes stronger? And then suddenly that debate completely disappeared. We know what happened. I mean, they were all bought by major corporations or by governments. But I was wondering, since you have an organization that arranges debates, what was your perception of basically the disappearance of that topic? How did it happen? When did it happen?
The disappearance of?
The discussion on what was going to happen to the media with the emergence of the internet. How will they maintain themselves as sustainable financial operations?
Yeah, well, in a way that discussion still happens, but it takes a different form. Now the entire discussion is around the extent to which you can trust the media, and especially the extent to which you can distrust the media out with the mainstream, which is very much gets it in the neck. That's well, I think the mainstream media has the level of trust in mainstream media has been decreasing for quite a number of years. I mean, journalists are quite famously very near the bottom of the professions that have any level of trust. Media organisations like the BBC are quite distrusted in Britain because people's experience of what is said in the media doesn't tally with what lots of the media are telling them is the problem. So to give a concrete example, if you looked at the coverage of something like Brexit right the way throughout 2015-16 in the lead up to the referendum, and indeed actually even more so in the period after the referendum when the struggle was on in Britain to make sure that Brexit became a reality and we left the European Union, then the way that the voting public was discussed, and let's remember at this point that more than half of the voting public voted for Brexit, but the way the public were discussed, particularly Brexiteers, was that they were fairly low-level characters. They were racist, they were on board with all sorts of dodgy ideas. So if you're a family sitting wherever in the country listening to BBC commentators relentlessly tell you that you're the type of person you are in not particularly praiseworthy terms, then you start to think, well, actually, that's not describing me, my family, the people that I know, the town that I'm living in. That constant telling of people as bad people, as racist people, as xenophobes, as nasty Brexiteers who all fall for misinformation and are easily fooled into voting for something that they passionately believed in, then your attitude towards mainstream media is not going to be a particularly healthy one.
But the experts say, no, just kidding. I appreciate the emphasis he put on the army of experts out there telling us one thing or another. That's really part of this whole problem, not just with free speech, but everything, and it explains the emergence of the populist movements. I keep thinking of Nassim Taleb. Do any of you know him? He's a financial writer, hedge fund guy, very interesting guy. He's more of a philosopher than anything. But he wrote in 2016, right after Brexit, and just before the Trump election, he wrote, "What we're watching now is the emergence of a global riot against the pseudo-experts." And I love that phrase, because that is the kind of movement I'm trying to support, foment, complement. And I think that is the future, not just in the United States, but also in Europe and other parts of the world. This rejection of experts telling people that they're ignorant, they don't know enough, they haven't studied enough, and that they should all get the jab, for example. I mean, there's many ways. I'm very supportive of that. Question here at this table.
Yes, thank you. So this question is for Mr. Donald as well. You talked about the politicization of free speech, and as one of the solutions you gave to revitalize the free speech by keeping politics out of this. And my question is how to do that. How can we get politics out of this whole way of control?
No, sorry, if I said that, then I misspoke. I don't think politics should be kept out of very much, because I'm fundamentally political, and I think pretty much everything worthwhile is around political discussion. The point I was trying to make, perhaps not very well, was that I think politics, or particularly the law, should not be politicized in the very direct manner that it's currently being politicized. So if you take something like, to give an example, a recent example in Britain, if you look at the riots that we had in Britain about 2 months ago, then it was almost the case that the police were, in quite a directly political way, were effectively told to arrest one side of the, because there's been trouble on many sides in Britain, but we have effectively developed a two-tier system of governance and rule over recent years, where people who are disliked by government, effectively, are treated in one way, and people whose views are a bit more acceptable are treated in a different way. So they're not equal before the law. So the point I was trying to make was that once the law is politicized in that way to treat different groups of people differently, then what you find is that free speech suffers because of that, because no one wants to discuss that politicization, and no one wants to give the freedom for the one group of people that are effectively disliked.
Okay, well, on the other hand, it's still interesting, because if I look at my own university where I'm active on, I see that institutions, especially universities, get more politicized, where people at the board who are in power, who most of the time have a lot of political networks, and they are influenced by certain ideologies, and they can control the free speech on universities. For example, which guest speakers can come, which events can be allowed on the universities. So I still see there is a politicization of also our institutions. Yeah. And do you maybe have a solution how to tackle that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem that you're talking about is that the things that ideally you want to be quite neutral, like institutions like a university, you don't necessarily want them to take a political lead on something, not least of all because you want the academics and the students that are part of that university to not be under the pressure of a university having a particular political position to then themselves have to adopt it. So you quite arguably want universities to be politically quite neutral. So it is a problem just now that universities, especially, I mean, you saw it really, I think two incidents illustrate the way it happened. First of all, when Russia invaded Ukraine, then lots of universities felt the need to make a statement on that invasion and to say that they supported Ukraine. Now, I supported Ukraine as well, but it doesn't mean to say that I want the university to get involved in that argument, but they did. And then when October the 7th happened last year and the situation in Gaza erupted, because they'd already made a political statement around one war, they felt the need to then make a political statement around the situation in Gaza. And effectively that was always with the type of people that are in control of universities these days, as broadly speaking, anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian statement, which then politicizes the whole university, because the lecturers no longer become free to, they feel under pressure at the very least to conform with the expectations that the universities adopted. So I think we need to get much smarter at understanding when it's appropriate to be political and when it is to fully engage in those political discussions in a fairly no holds barred way with complete and utter free speech. And when politicizing things in situations like institutions or around the law is a fundamentally bad thing. And at that point, we need to say, no, these things should not be matters, should not be politicized in the same way.
There's a question back there.
Yeah, so I guess my question is to all three of you. So you've talked a lot about the kind of legal clampdowns, and then also, Rob, you talked about kind of self-censorship and the cultural hegemonies of newsrooms and institutions and how those impact free speech. And while we've been talking about the politicization of the law, which I think is there, it also seems to be the case that within institutions, the whole idea is to depoliticize any of these issues. So you try to depoliticize things like supporting Ukraine or environmentalism or any of these issues. And that's what makes it okay for a university, for example, to take a political stance, is that it's argued that it's not political. So my question is, in the fight back against kind of free speech impositions, it seems like you could take a legal route, but how much of the fight back needs to be political or needs to be legal, and how much of this is actually about culture, and how do you draw the balance there between whether the problem really is the law or the problem is a culture that attempts to depoliticize any issue that actually is meant to be political and fought out on a political battleground?
Can we start with Rob? Because
Yeah,
you brought
well,
up this point.
I think it's both political, or it's both cultural and also legal. We see the cultural thing is that what I try to explain is that people are not brave enough to speak out because they are very afraid to be cancelled, and that's really happening. It happened a lot. For example, I was in the European Parliament, but before I was there, I was for 32 years in energy. I had my own engineering company, and I told Timmermans many times that we could not do this energy transition. It's just physics and mathematics. But the only thing they said, oh, you are a climate denier, we don't talk to you. So, but also about the war in Ukraine, for example, it was, I condemned what Putin have done, but we impose all this we had this restrictions on delivering of goods and buying energy from Russia, etc. So, but it was not helping. You know, I had the figures. I could show that it was not helping. That Russia was still selling its oil to India, and we bought it back. So it was just. But it was very difficult to speak about that. Everyone was in the parliament at that time, was everyone saying, we will win this war, we will win this war. But still, I had the feeling I had to make that point, but I'm very brave, and I really speak out. But at that time, I was completely alone in that big parliament with my own point of view. And at that time, I also felt really a little bit embarrassed to do this speech. I did it. I thought it was necessary. Someone has to do it. But it's really, there's so much pressure on people, especially in public, to speak out. It's always very easy to be on the right side of history, what they think that's the right side of history. But also the judicial system, it's abused. What we see now, there is a lot of, well, for example, President Trump, how many lawsuit has he against him? I think 36, just to silence him. And it's you know, they can put so much pressure on people, even when they know it is not right to start a legal procedure against someone, but it's so emotional to be in a legal procedure, and it costs so much money, and especially when you fight against a big state, it's really difficult to stay alive, literally. And so I think it's both cultural and it's also legal that it's very difficult to speak out. The only thing that we can do is that we speak out together as much as possible. But someone has to be the first one and has to be brave. And to be honest, you know, we had the Second World War, and there were also people in the resistance. They risked their lives to fight for our freedom, and that's what I always keep in mind. It's not that bad, fortunately, but we have to be brave and we have to speak out, even if it's difficult. And if we do it together, it's much easier than if it's someone is doing it on his own.
Would you like to address a question about culture versus political/legal responses?
Yeah, I think. Well, to give try and give an example, in the UK over the past 3 or 4 years, we've gone through a process of trying to address the free speech situation in universities with a bit of legislation called the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which, after about 3 years of debate in the political sphere in Parliament, which I had kind of mixed views about this act, because I think on the one hand it's quite a good thing that in politics there's enough of the political representatives in our Parliament who want to introduce or who are worried about free speech in universities, that they want to do something about it. So that seems to me to be a good thing. And the idea of doing something about it and debating it in Parliament also seemed to be a good thing. The Act was eventually passed after a lot of toing and froing in Parliament. It got very much watered down. But the problem with it is that I don't think a bit of legislation, even if it's a pro-free speech bit of legislation, is going to resolve the situation in universities, because I cannot see how you can legislate free speech into existence. It seems to me that it doesn't come from a law demanding that you speak freely or listen to someone else or whatever it is, even although it gives some sort of legal redress to academics who are not allowed to speak and students who are not allowed to speak within their student union. That just, to me, doesn't seem to way that you can resolve the clampdown on free speech, because it's not built a level of cultural support within the universities, amongst academics and amongst students, many of whom do not want free speech in universities, because for whatever, not necessarily because they're anti-free speech, but because they value safety and well-being over and above the ability to speak freely. And I think this is the sort of understanding that we have to realize, that safety these days is such an important issue for people that it overrides their concern for being able to speak freely.
But it's always a one-way street. It's always in favor of the left liberals and not in favor of the conservatives. It's always that the left liberals should have a safe space, and they call us all kinds of names. They don't care about that.
I think that's true, but it's an underpinning justification for why there isn't more support for free speech.
Yeah.
And I think we have to address that kind of welfarist idea that undermines free speech.
Excellent.
Hi. Thank you for edifying talk. There's been shots exchanged between Elon Musk and the now resigned Thierry Breton in the European Union over the DSA and his attempts to curtail freedom of speech on social media platforms, many of which are registered in Dublin. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on potential conflict between the US administration, either a Trump or a potentially a Harris administration, and the European Union over freedom of speech. I know that Jim Jordan recently wrote to Mr. Breton about this.
I'll start with that, and then you can weigh in. My short and simplistic answer is I'm looking forward to a conflict, especially with the Trump administration, which I think is imminent. I think it's the only way. My wife said it best yesterday about the consensus-based approach to politics, whether it's domestic or international, has failed us time and time again. And I'm looking for a few more confrontations between a Trump administration and the EU. You gentlemen? You agree, I think.
Yeah. First of all, it was such a strange letter. If two American people want to have a conversation together online, and an unelected commissioner, a bureaucrat of the European Commission, starting to interfere in that discussion, for me it was insane. And so I condemned also this letter. For me it was really insane that he was involved. But so I think if Kamala Harris will be elected as the president, they will go on the same route as the European Union Commission is doing, and that is the way of censorship. I think if President Trump is re-elected, then we have free speech again, and then we will have this conversation between, let's say, the European Commission and the Trump administration. And I'm also looking forward to that, because I'm so happy with Elon Musk. They now are completely desperate because they were in control. They had everything. We have seen that during COVID. It was such a marvelous example how they controlled every aspect of the narrative. And they controlled all the social media. And then there was a billionaire who is sending rockets to Mars, and he buys Twitter and transformed that to X, and everyone is in panic now. And I love that, because really, without X, we still had the idea that because the mainstream media told us so, that the hospital in Gaza was bombed by the Israelis. But because of X, we knew within 2 days it was the opposite. So it is really very interesting what's going on right now. And I'm also looking forward, I hope President Trump will be elected, and that we have a good conflict about the freedom of speech, and that the American platform X will be protected by the Americans.
I think actually the Thierry Breton thing was interesting precisely because it was an instance of things getting a little bit out of control at the EU. So I think effectively he's paid the price actually for that incident. I find it difficult to believe that he would have been sacked yesterday without that incident, whatever reason it's dressed up for. But the upstreaming of censorship within the EU is not meant to be a public thing. It's meant to the EU operates at its best behind closed doors in a fashion that's meant to take any contest about these things out of the public sphere and make them procedural matters that go through a commission and go through a kind of procedural process to become a reality. And writing that letter, he signed his death warrant by effectively, I mean, he was trying to get back at Musk because he was pissed off that Musk had publicly announced that they tried to cook up that deal a few months ago where the EU offered him immunity. But ideally, they want all these things done behind closed doors. That's the way that the EU operates, and that's the new model of the way that censorship is meant to offer and meant to operate. And I'm not sure if I see America standing up to this. In fact, Musk himself has been happy to compromise where it suited him. I mean, he compromised with China, for example, where he didn't stand up for X's interests and the interests of his other companies. So he's willing to compromise in places. I think you cannot rely on a corporation to win the fight for free speech. It needs to be won politically and culturally.
Yes, I have a question for Roos. Besides the USA elections that might be important, is there still something that the national parliaments and the European parliaments can do against this DSA from the European Commission? If this leads to controlling the narrative or to censorship, are there still measurements of resistance that national governments or the European Parliament can take?
Well, I don't have really good news for you. The problem with European law is that it supersedes national law. So once it's adopted, it's there. And in theory, we can get rid of it if the Commission opens this law and wants to change it. But that's only in theory. It will not happen. So I did the negotiations on, when I was in Parliament on this file, and I was very against it. And my first question to Thierry Breton was, is this the new Ministry of the Ministry of Truth? And I said, no. I said, but how are we going to prevent that free speech is going away? How can we make sure that we can have debates about sensitive topics like Islamism, immigration, about the Green Deal, etc. You know, but no, it's not a problem. We are going to arrange that. But the first thing I wanted to do, I said I want to have a definition, and I wish it wasn't possible. I knew that, but I said I want to have what is a definition about hate speech? What is hate speech, and what is harmful speech? And of course, they could not make it, and that is danger, the big danger of this Digital Services Act, because you can define everything as harmful, and it's all about emotions, and we should prevent that. But it's there, and it's not going away anymore. That's really a problem.
That reminds me that there used to be a Supreme Court Justice, Potter Stewart, who was dealing with a pornography case. Do any of you recall this? And he was asked, how do you define pornogaphy? He says, I know it when I see it. That's it. That's the definition. And it's similar to what is hate speech? Well, I don't know. Go ahead. And the question over here.
Yes. Thank you, Lena Karin from Sweden. So I have two questions, if it's okay. One for Alastair and the other for Rob. Freedom of speech is limited to the receiver's reaction, in a way. So it's the receiver who decides if it's violating any law or anything. So how did we go there? How did this happen? So that's the one for Alastair. And the other one is for Rob. So how can we make the movements and transformation from the pure intellectual debate, exchange ideas? The arena for that is sort of contagious in a way, and it kills the debate. But how can we make the movements from that? Hopefully you understand my questions. Thank you.
You want to start? You, Alastair?
How did we get there? Well, I think it's got a lot to do with the process that I talked about in the context of the civil rights stuff, which was that sometime in the late 1960s and early 1970s, we seemed to move from an understanding of individuals as quite robust, as willing to engage in the cut and thrust of a debate, not to take offense, into an understanding of them as a little bit vulnerable, as worried about being harmed, about taking offense. We came to associate taking offense as being something that we must protect people from. it seemed to me to revolve around that changing understanding of the individual that happened about 55 decades ago. And we've come out the other side of it, and we've started to reorganize the way that we both understand speech, understand terms like hate speech, which, as Rob was saying, are very subjectively defined, i.e. they're not really defined at all. They're as what I dislike or what you dislike if I say something to you. So I think we've got to recover a much more an understanding of us all as individuals, as people that are quite robust and willing to trade insults. I'm not arguing for trading insults, but when it comes down to it, I think we are robust enough to stand up to someone calling us something. Sticks and stones break my bones, but words don't ever harm me, really.
I'll compliment that later, but the second question was for Rob, right?
Yeah, but can you repeat just a little? Yeah, well, sure. I can hear you.
It's how can we make the movements, because the arena of discussion and exchange, the arena for exchanging ideas are contagious in a way, like people are using words that kills the dialogue. So how can we move from there?
Yeah, well, it starts with being brave. We should not let. That's what I said. We should not be scared of people yelling at us. We should be scared of good people who are silenced. But we have to speak out as much as possible. If we want to, the only way to prevent that we are silenced is as much as free speech as possible. And maybe we have now this Digital Services Act, but they can use it against us. It's only for platforms, so we can speak offline, but online is also very important. And I think we have also to do some legal stuff. We have to go to the court to defend. I was during COVID, I was very outspoken about things, and I was not against vaccination, but I was very in favor of a free choice and not of all this suppression. But I was cancelled. They kicked me off LinkedIn for sharing my own speech. It was just questions to the Commission. It cost me a lot of money. I went to court here. I hired a lawyer, and I had to go to LinkedIn. They are here in Ireland. But for me, it was a principal thing to defend that the right to speak and to have my account back. And that is what we really should do, and as much people as possible, because they cannot throw us in jail. All of us. So, yeah. It's a tough fight. We are not there.
Satisfied with that? All right. The comment I wanted to make to compliment Alastair's last comment has to do, well, how did we get here? Everything you said is true, I believe. I agree with what you said. But I think we also make a mistake by only looking at external factors. I think there's something that's gone on internally in our societies across the West. And the person who got me thinking about this is a professor of psychology called Matthias Desmet at the University of Ghent. He's got a book, came out in 2022, which I recommend, a bit challenging, but it's very insightful, called The Psychology of Totalitarianism. And he talks about, he's a specialist in mass formation, the formation of mass mind, herd mentality, groupthink. And he started researching this in earnest in 2019, 2020 with COVID-19. And he was looking at how fear and the manipulation of data and then the pseudo-experts and all these other factors have created societies that are malleable, and they've internalized the totalitarian mentality. So one of you mentioned about auto or self-censorship. We live in this kind of society now across the West, and we're even on the right. We're quick to, as Ellen said yesterday, we're quick to censor the people on our right, the flank on our right, We're quick to not appear threatening to others. We're quick to censor our own people. But broader still, beyond just the right, I think it's a society-wide phenomenon, and I think that's really contributed to it. We've internalized these mechanisms that facilitate totalitarianism, and that should be terrifying.
But I think that is also because we think that this freedom is the modus operandi, but it's not. You know, we live in a very special time, in a very special place, and we should realize that, and we should maintain that, because we have to fight for it. If you cancel your maintenance, your service for your car, you can do it one time, you can do it 2 times, but the 3rd time it will break, and we have to fight for this special freedom that we have, that no one else has on the other parts of the world, and also in time. So we are privileged.
Can I add a little to the question from the lady, how did we get here? And you mentioned a book by a psychologist on people internalizing the sense of totalitarianism. I'm a psychiatrist, and I noticed in the late 1980s, early 1990s, people were more and more and more requesting therapy. They weren't happy with just medication, and these would have been people with major mental illnesses where therapy really didn't have a part to play. They had very major mental illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, PTSD, things where medication was necessary. But they still wanted psychotherapy, and that would be their preference. And gradually, I think people have more and more since then bought into the notion of it used to be a pill for every ill, and it's become a therapy for every ill. And now what were regarded as ills in the past and illnesses and vulnerabilities are now seen, what were regarded as being extreme and unusual in the past have now become very much more common. So people commonly view themselves now as vulnerable and ill for very minor things. If a relationship breaks up, people will run off to a therapist. Mm-hmm. When people are going through normal bereavement, they go off to therapists, and all the evidence is that actually in neither is therapy indicated. It may actually be harmful. So I think the idea of people seeing themselves as vulnerable has probably fed into some of the political agendas that you've been discussing, that we've been discussing here, of wanting to control people, control their environments. And the result is that there is a mass sense of vulnerability, not helped, of course, by Prince Harry when he started talking about his own mental health a number of years ago. So people have bought into this notion of a collective kind of need for help and assistance, and I think that's one of the many features of it, or factors playing into it.
Well, it's like Alastair said. Yeah.
Well, I think that's exactly right, actually, and that's a very useful way of understanding it. And once you're into that mindset, then words can be incredibly wounding. So whereas before it might have been the threat of physical violence that people were concerned about, these days words are conceived of as a form of violence in and of themselves by people who inhabit this kind of psychologized, vulnerable world. And that does provide the underpinning for lots of the free speech restrictions these days, especially in universities. I mean, you cannot move for welfare departments and welfare officers in universities, and all these charity-type support groups that are there to support mental health initiatives, who are actually incredibly rooted quite often in some of the political trends that we've become so used to in recent years, especially in the trans ideology stuff. If you look at the links between mental health support groups in universities and their attachment to organizations like Stonewall, they're actually quite strong. And what I suspect is that over the next period, you will see some of the pursuit of some of the political ambitions of organizations like Stonewall. They'll be pursued through mental health charities and mental support groups within universities, and that will be the form that takes. So it's part of a broader medicalization of lots of social problems. That's effectively how it works. I suppose the one point in that story where people continue it into that I get a little bit nervous about is the Jonathan Haidt and anxious generation stuff, where smartphones all of a sudden take the blame for a lot of this stuff. And that's where I draw the line, because I think there's far bigger problems in the world than smartphones, and I don't find them a very valuable explanation for why it is that we need to put bans on kids using phones or whatever. I think the social and cultural broader factors are much bigger than that. I mean, for example, something like, we talked in the opening session yesterday a little bit, I think it was James Orr, about the importance of tradition, and that being a kind of fundamental value that we build on. Well, I sort of agree with that, but I think the attack on tradition, I mean, tradition's not these days, it doesn't just take place within the context of quite a traditional debate between the left being more interested in the future and the right being a bit more interested in conserving traditions. The past these days is discussed as poisonous, as completely toxic. So we're into a whole new area of discussion these days where contemporary society tries to deliberately distance itself from the past because it conceives of colonialism or slavery or whatever it is as a real problem. And I think once you're into that mentality of seeing the past as poisonous, then it becomes very, very difficult for young people to grow up in an atmosphere where they're rooted in something and where they understand their history and are able to develop a kind of positive outlook towards the future. So I think those sorts of explanations are important. Your sort of explanations around the kind of the fragile self, as it were, as it's sometimes talked about, are very important. Banning smartphones, kind of less so.
About being rooted, I'm not a psychologist, but I was thinking for all these people who have this trouble. If I have this trouble, I have my family, you know, and maybe it is a lack of strong families and also the faith in God. I don't know. We replaced everything with traditional values, and but it's not my experience. I don't know.
There's a huge literature on the role of religion in preventing mental illness.
Yeah, I think it helps.
Thank you. My final comment, as we're out of time, is that this shows why conservatism is the way forward. We conservatives are the ones who embrace the full gamut of human experience, the tragic, the comic, the highs, the lows, and we don't go running for drugs or pills, or we shouldn't be. I mean, so remember that when you're debating with your progressive friends who are telling you that we're narrow and impoverished of mind. Anyway, thank you. Thanks, Rob and Alastair.
Thank you.
See you later.